morning, everyone. Guys, I'm really impressed with the uniform standards. Well done.
A new uniform check for the new term at the John Smeaton School in Leeds. The secondary's just been taken over by the Gorse Academy's trust.
You guys have spent a lot of time at home during lockdown.
After 18 months of disruption, the government in England wants students to have a much more normal education experience, and so they've done away with masks, bubbles and social distancing.
I want you to have a think on your whiteboard. I'm going to give you 3 minutes, okay?
But what pupils will have to decide is whether to have the COVID vaccine, after the government's decision to offer all 12 to 15-year-olds 1 dose of the Pfizer jab. It's a controversial decision, which goes against the view of its own vaccine advisory body, the JCVI, who believe the health benefits will be marginal.
I think that there is a natural anxiety within parents and also within students, understandably, because I suppose there's been a lot of mixed messages, I feel, regarding the effectiveness, regarding the safety, perhaps.
So how will children make up their minds? 15-year-old Layla told me there are already rumours and scare stories on social media.
A lot of people do make rumours or jokes, silly jokes, but people think it's real and saying all silly stuff like, oh, your leg's going to fall off if you have the COVID vaccine. So
because of all those rumours and everything going around on social media, do you think people your age will be hesitant?
Most definitely. It kind of makes you worry, like, oh, if I get this vaccine, what will happen to me?
I myself actually did get COVID at one point, and my grandma had COVID. Sadly, she did pass away of COVID, so...
Oh, that's sad. I'm sorry to hear that.
After his loss, Ethan says he will get the jab because he wants to try and protect the rest of his family.
So Blair protects me against it, so that'll help give me some reassurance around the whole COVID.
This hall will soon be transformed into a vaccination centre for students. But like others, the Trust has received letters from pressure groups threatening legal action if they allow their premises to be used to deliver the jab. Controversially, students can get vaccinated even if their parents don't want them to, as long as a clinician deems that they're competent enough to decide for themselves. School leaders say they don't want to be dragged into the middle of family disputes.
We've lost an enormous amount of time in terms of the core business of education over the course of the time since the pandemic started.
The Trust's chief executive says dealing with the vaccines is a distraction for schools.
It's not our area of expertise, it's not our area of moral responsibility, but I would be very, very disappointed if we found ourselves, before the autumn term has even got up and running properly, finding very significant disruption in schools because of conflict with parents.
Government advisers admit that families will face uncertainty and debate because of inconsistencies in advice.
It's about the testing, really. Has there been enough testing done? The kids' bodies are still developing, aren't they?
I think it's a good idea that she gets vaccinated, but she's not thinking it is.
None of us know what's in it, really, but they wouldn't offer it if it wasn't safe, I don't think.
Despite the debate over the benefits, the Department for Education says its overall priority is to limit the disruption for children who have already lost so much learning.
Hi ladies, see you tomorrow.
The first doses will start to be administered next week. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Leeds.
Well, joining me now is Amanda Spielman, who's Chief Inspector of Ofsted, England's education watchdog. Amanda Spielman, I'll come to vaccination and the reason for it at the moment, but just first I wanted to ask how concerned you were about the scale of missed learning in schools.
I've been enormously concerned over the last 18 months. Even though most schools did manage to organise themselves to have a reasonable remote learning offer and put an immense amount of work into it, it's very clear that children have learnt much less and that quite a substantial proportion of children, for a whole host of reasons, technology access, special educational needs, parents who are busy working or have got younger children to look after, or who just lost motivation, that many children couldn't take full advantage of it. So we know that we're starting this year with many children far behind where they would normally be.
And do you have any evidence of the number of children who just simply haven't returned after the lockdowns?
It's a little bit early to say. We just went back to inspection this week. We're an important part of the system. I think it's very valuable that Ofsted inspection is starting again, but literally my inspectors went in for the first time today. But I think we'll get a real handle soon on the proportion of children who are being educated permanently at home, the proportion who've moved overseas, and of course, how many are happily back in school.
And you said today that some schools had focused primarily on handing out food parcels in the early days of the pandemic to the poorest children, rather than a decent online learning offer across the board. Wasn't it right, though, that schools had to focus most attention and resources on the most disadvantaged?
I wasn't expressing a view here. I was explaining why there were very different experiences. I had many parents say that I had children at 2 different schools, and one of them through the summer gave us a lot of remote education, and the other didn't seem to do anything. And I was explaining that I'd heard from a number of schools that they'd decided to prioritise the most disadvantaged schools, visit them, organise food parcels to replace free school meals and so on. I was explaining the difference in experience. I think it was disappointing that there weren't clear expectations through the summer term on what the minimum schools should provide was. There was no guidance for schools at that point, but by the autumn that had been rectified, and there was a much clearer expectation about what schools should do, and I think much greater consistency between schools, so children's experience came right in line.
I'm sure a lot of schools would say, well, it's a question of resources. When you look at the money that's being put into the NHS to help clear the backlog, you look at £1.4 billion that the government's provided for education, way short of the £15 billion that the catch-up czar Kevin Collins demanded. Do you think ministers need to urgently look at finding more cash for schools?
There's no question that some children need quite a lot of support services at the moment. I know that many schools' budgets have been put under pressure, for example, by the withdrawal of many local authority services. Schools are having to provide or pay for services that children used to receive from elsewhere. There's a first instalment of catch-up funding has arrived. We're going to be doing work looking at the effectiveness of that. But I think it's important to say that most of the catch-up that children achieve will happen in their normal classrooms with their normal teachers. Catch-up isn't a separate school that runs in parallel. It's about the extra support that a minority of children need to help make sure they get back into the normal swing of lessons as quickly as possible. So keeping everything tied tightly together is really important at this stage.
I mean, obviously, a key battle is keeping schools open, and that's why the vaccination campaign is being rolled out. Unprecedented, isn't it, to vaccinate kids to not just to benefit their health, but also to stop them missing out on education. Is that the right decision from an educational perspective?
Well, I'm no vaccination expert, so I'm not going to express any views on public health matters like that. But I can say how glad I am that children are likely to have a much less disrupted experience this year. I think the removal of the guidance requiring bubbles and requiring isolation of child contacts of COVID cases had a huge impact last year. With the lifting of that, no child who isn't themselves positive needs to be out of school. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to have a much better experience for children this year, whether or not vaccination happens.
Amanda Spielman, thanks very much for joining me. Well, I'm now joined by Sir John Townsend, who's the Chief Executive of the Gorse Academies Trust, which runs 12 schools, including this one, and a parent of a pupil at this school, Laura Edwards. Welcome to you both, and thanks for letting us film in the school. Sir John, your chain of academies has received a letter from anti-vaxxers, basically threatening legal action if you host vaccinations down here, as you're intending to downstairs. Does that make you slightly worried about being the place where kids are getting their jabs?
No. So I have no intention of getting involved in any of that discussion whatsoever. We're not experts in the vaccination programme. We're not clinical experts at all. Our job is to educate children. We fully recognise why the government is acting in the way it is. Our job is to facilitate that process, so to use our buildings to escort children to those vaccinations. We'll be doing no more than that from what I understand, although the evidence has only just come through today. I don't intend for my staff or myself to get involved in any of those discussions whatsoever.
So if there's legal action, you're going to pass that straight on to the NHS, are you?
NHS and government, it's not for us to get involved. We've got a big job to do in returning to normal operations within our school. The last thing I need is to get involved in that stuff.
And I want to come to that, but what if there's a dispute between a parent and child? You know, the child doesn't want to get vaccinated and the parent, or vice versa. What does the school do? How are you going to handle that?
We're not going to handle it at all. We don't intend to get involved in any of those disputes. We have no expertise with regards to vaccination programmes. That will be extremely time-consuming. It's not our particular business.
But do you prioritise the parent or the child?
We expect clinicians and experts to deal with that. We're not in that position to do so.
Well, let's bring in Laura Edwards here, because you've got to decide whether to have your 14-year-old son vaccinated. Do you know what you're going to do yet?
I'm still very undecided. My son is a firm no at the minute, but I think we just need to read up on everything that's available and make an informed decision when the time's right.
And would you let him make that decision, or do you think you're the one in the driving seat here?
I think 14's possibly a little bit young. I can understand for children a bit older. I suppose it depends on the child. It depends on how mature they are and their level of understanding on the situation.
And I mean, you've got a big challenge here because, you know, the school here failed some Ofsted inspections before you came in to take it over. With that and the pandemic, how big a challenge is it for you to turn this around?
The great challenges facing our country, there are two big things we need to do. One is to get children back into routine in their schools as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. I understand why this vaccine programme now is up and running to increase the chances of that disruption being minimised, and I support that. And we've got to make sure this vaccine programme is done in a really efficient way. What we've then got to do is look really seriously at whether all children have been affected by this pandemic in an equal way, and that clearly from all the evidence is not the case. Disadvantaged children, those whose lives are characterised by privation, have been most badly affected, and we need to think about that really carefully in terms of next year's examination series, the way we inspect schools and accountability frameworks.
Have you got the resources you need? I was saying to Amanda Spielman that the catch-up czar got 1.4 billion out of the 15 billion he was asking for.
The government, since 2011, has sought to enormously prioritise less advantaged children in this country. It's time to really step up and increase the momentum on that work. Otherwise, if we don't act, we will set ourselves back a further 10 years. The gap between those who do well in our schools, who are privileged in their lives, and the gap between those and children who really struggle at home and have a life of poverty, that will widen further and very significantly.
Laura, how far behind do you think the kids have fallen because of the pandemic?
I think for certain children it's catastrophic, and I think it just depends on your situation at home, obviously, and the support that your school offered to you at the time. But I'm lucky my child is quite headstrong and motivated, so I personally am fine with where he's at the minute, but I do know that obviously for other children it's not the same situation.
Well, I hope you resolve that controversy over the jab. Laura Edwards and Sir John Townsley, thank you both very much for joining us.